As some of you might have picked up, I've become very fond of the Pikmin games this year. I already did a video ranking the bosses in the third game, and now despite how much YouTube's telling me it's a bad idea, I want to cover the other games as well. I put up a poll to gauge interest, and the winner was the first game, which is good for me because it was probably going to be the next one I did regardless. It's the shortest game in the series and should be easy to write for. This isn't my favourite of the series, but it is still an excellent game that I love with all my heart. Going back to basics after becoming so familiar with all the features introduced in the sequels has been really weird, but in a good way. No sprays, switching between captains, lock-on features, dog with the power of God, just good old-fashioned Pikmin gameplay with the bare essentials. The core gameplay is as solid as ever, with a great story to motivate you and really solid level designs full of tons of memorable creatures to fight, including the boss lineup. Looking at the Pikmin wiki, there are only 8 bosses. 4 considered major, 4 considered minor. And I think they're all comparable enough to each other to where I don't want to exclude anything like I did for the mini-bosses in 3. Plus, come on, do you really expect me to not include the Smoky Prog? There isn't much else to go over, just that I'll be ranking all 8 bosses in terms of how much I like them, with any repeats taken into account. I say that, but the only one to appear more than once is the Armored Cannon Beetles, so that's not going to play too much of a role. And given how this isn't going to be a particularly long or in-depth video, I won't need to split this up into segments, so let's just get on with it. The bottom 2 kind of go hand in hand since they're the surprise secret bosses at the impact site, the Gulix and the Mamuta. The former shows up from odd number days from 9 onwards, the latter shows up on even number days from 8 onwards. These are cool secrets if you happen to stumble across them, and I love both of their designs. The liquid body of the Gulix is distinct from everything else in the game, and the Mamuta doesn't look hostile in the slightest, really helping to get across its gentle nature. In fact, if we're talking just as a creature, I love the Mamuta so much as an addition to the Pikmin universe. This docile rock guy who just likes planting your Pikmin into the ground and helping them sprout into flowers. Hell, that's if you even provoke it in the first place. This thing only starts smacking in retaliation. Leave it alone and it won't bother you. Take your yellows and the bomb rocks around, blow up the wall to get to the positron generator, and you're all set. It adds so much more to this world that not every single creature you encounter is a vicious predator, and making you question what you're willing to do to survive on this alien planet, even making you feel kinda shitty for killing certain creatures, obviously isn't a primary focus of the series, but I think it can do that pretty well sometimes. That comes at the cost, however, of it kind of being a boring boss fight. It can't kill your Pikmin, only bury them. The only thing it can damage is Olimar, but so long as you can stick a swarm of it, you can deplete its health fairly quickly. The only real danger is the nuisance of having to pluck the Pikmin it buries, because this is the only game in the series that doesn't streamline that process at all. Sure, it flowers them instantly, so it can be helpful in some situations, but you can do that in the other areas with Nectar anyway, which is a much less roundabout way of doing it that doesn't take up a whole day at the impact site. I guess it can also blow up bomb rocks, but the odds of you making enough of a blunder to have one near it are pretty slim. And if that all sounds not very interesting, then keep in mind that's not even last place because I think the Gulix is much worse. All I can say this has over the Mamuta is that it spawns in the arena after you arrive, so it can jump scare you if you don't know to expect it, and that there is some strategy to speeding up the process since you can do more damage by hitting the large core directly, or whistling back any Pikmin latched onto the smaller core. Too bad the fight itself is a whole load of nothing. If you bring reds or yellows, they straight up can't do anything. They touch the creature and they'll start to drown. And if you bring blues, you've basically already won. The Gulix has no other attacks, so it can't hurt them. Like the Mamuta, yeah, it can still hurt Olimar, which isn't much of an advantage since instead of an engaging fight where you have to be in the line of danger, you can just take your squad on it and stay out of its reach. I haven't tried it myself, but I wouldn't be shocked if you could just dismiss a squad of blues in the arena and let them have at it while you go and do other things. And as cool as it is to be able to speed the fight up, at least from my perspective, it doesn't even matter. As much as I normally champion how Pikmin focuses on time management, the impact site has exactly one other thing to do after the tutorial, which will absolutely not take you the full 13 minutes. The Pearly Clamps serve as much more engaging obstacles than either of these boss fights, which is a little bit embarrassing. Well, what if you want to consider it from a speedrunner's perspective where every second matters? Well, in that case, congratulations, you've finished the game before either of these two is even able to spawn. I still say I'm glad they're in the game for providing a bit more to do in the smallest area, and I do quite like them as creatures separate from their fights, but as bosses, the Mamuta's pretty underwhelming and the Gulix straight up sucks. They both had potential to be so much more. Not too huge of a gap between them and our next one, the Puffstool. In concept, I love this one. In execution, I kinda like it, but not that much. much. I find the idea of this big goober of a mushroom that can't actually do anything itself hilarious. Its running and tripping animations have so much personality. And then when it releases its spores and turns your Pikmin into Puffmen which fight back against you, that's fucking sick. A shame that the actual fight is kinda piss easy because of that. The spores are super short ranged and not hard to avoid with how slowly they come out. On my 2 replays of the game in preparation for this video, I went kind of easy on it because I wanted there to be a higher chance of me getting to see more of what the Puffman can actually do. I wasn't just gonna throw the fight and let it do its thing, but I wasn't gonna be super urgent about getting my squad out of the way. I still ended up getting through both battles with me and my troops going completely untouched. A little bit disappointing there, especially since the only other thing it has that can do any kind of damage is a glitch in its death animation, which I've never encountered. For my money, it's the least dangerous thing in the entire forest navel. That includes the shearwigs, the static fire geysers, and this small puddle of water. They were super close to a banger with this one. I like a lot about it, particularly how its running and down states are respectively vulnerable to swarming and throwing Pikmin while being immune to the other, but I think it falls just a little bit short. Still outranks the Impact Site duo by virtue of being able to fight back in any capacity. Rounding out the bottom half with a massive jump in quality is the Burrowing Snagret. This is the only boss in the list to appear in every game in the series, only getting worse each time. Well, okay, jury's out on whether it's better in 2 or 3. I'll keep you guys posted when I replay 2. Each passing game nerfs it into the ground, giving you stronger tools to take it out quicker, isolating it, and making it leave itself vulnerable. In the first game, not only do you not have purples, rocks, or lock-on to rely on, but they put 3 of them in the arena to make it even trickier if you don't manage your squad properly. That helps to make it a much more engaging and lengthier fight, enhancing it far more than if you just had to deal with one. I also like how all 3 Pikmin types have their own viability in this part of the Forest of Hope. Reds obviously do the most damage, yellow's greater throw height makes them easier to latch onto the Snagret's weak spots on their heads, and blues have no advantage in the fight, but they are needed to open the arena up from the water, at least in the way the devs intended, and they can carry treasures back through a quicker route, so they can help save time if you want to get everything done in one day. The fight itself is really simple, far from the flashiest, trickiest, or most elaborate out there, but very fun to try and get through without the big bird snakes being able to pick off your Pikmin, and without getting too many of them to surface at the same time if you're not prepared for it. Their designs are pretty iconic too. Gotta give it up for the best assist trophy in Smash Bros. So long as you just ignore all the ones that are objectively more powerful. Now we have an honestly pretty tight race between the top 4. All of these had a good shot at taking the top spot, and ordering them was pretty tricky. But drawing the short straw here is the Armored Cannon Beetle. This one has tended to not be one of the fan favourites in the tier list that I've seen, but I really enjoy it. Yes, it is kinda simple and easy once you figured out how to deal with it, but it is not without potential peril. How this one works is that you have to throw a Pikmin into the hole on its head when it's preparing to shoot a rock out at you. And then while it's recovering, you attack the flesh, which would normally be covered by its armoured hides. In my first playthrough, I thought you specifically needed a bomb rock to lob at it, so you can imagine I wasted quite a lot of time before I figured out that any Pikmin will do and that I just wasn't timing it correctly. I managed to avoid it in the Forest of Hope by distracting it while my squad snuck around the back of it with the radiation canopy. I thought I had outsmarted the game, only to be met with a second encounter in the distant spring where you have to defeat it in order for the bowsprit to spawn. So I spent ages trying to get the bomb rocks to work on a boss that I had cheated myself out of learning how to properly deal with and ended up needing to reset a few times after I ran out. Great job, me. I really like how it progresses from an optional boss to a mandatory one, with the arena getting much more cramped the second go around, making it feel much more claustrophobic and tense. And while the hitboxes stun it and make it vulnerable can be a bit finicky, like a certain blue man has said in the past, I love that the only way to make it vulnerable at all forces you to face it head on and stand directly in the line of fire, where if you mess up, there is not enough time to dodge its attack, which is large and can crush the majority of your Pikmin in one shot. It's so exciting and nerve-wracking to try and time the throw right, more than makes up for how easy it can be to take it out in one cycle. But even then, the mad scramble to kill it quick enough so you don't have to stare down the eye of the beast a second time is really fun. Excellent stuff here that I think was the perfect choice to be the only repeated boss in the game. Taking the bronze medal is the often imitated, never replicated, beady longlegs. I have very little to say about this one. I like how it jump scares you by dropping down from the sky when you enter the arena, and I like that it gives a similar choice to the Snagrets in terms of which Pikmin you want to bring in. Blues have basically no place here, but you do have to choose between reds doing the most damage and being able to carry things back through the fire geysers, or have the yellows which are able to be thrown onto the weak spot that would normally be out of reach, and bring bomb rocks in with them. Now, yes, you can bring both, but large groups aren't exactly ideal to take into Fight Beady, since its massive legs can crush far more Pikmin at a time than the Snagrets can eat. making this an easy one to lose a ton of Pikmin to, especially if any stragglers start trailing off and start attacking the legs, which they can't do anything to. It's a simple but extremely effective fight that's the perfect way for me to wrap up each adventure to the Forest Navel. The runner-up, who's not taking the top spot like I was anticipating, is the Smoky Prog. I thought you were stronger. This is the Pikmin equivalent to the Luigi Purple Coins level in Mario Galaxy. Is it easy? No, it's still a decent challenge, but compared to the horrors I'd heard about it, I honestly expected way worse. I actually completely avoided it on my first playthrough because I knew it would kick my inexperienced ass. On my first replay for this video, I neglected to keep track of the day counter while I finished the earlier areas, so I ended up getting through the Distant Spring on day 15 exactly, which is right as the spawn window for the prog runs out. So a third playthrough of the game ended up being completely mandatory, even if I was probably going to do one anyway. And when I finally did fight it, I reset the day 3 times to give myself a good amount of experience with it. The first time it took a good few Pikmin out, but I still didn't have as much trouble with it as I was anticipating, and it went down way quicker than I thought it would. The second time the health bar when trying to crack the egg ran all the way down to the bottom and the thing died before it could even spawn. I don't know if that's a common thing people experience. Please let me know if it happened to you as well, because I couldn't see anything about it on the wiki. And on the final day, the egg just wasn't budging. I got it down to half health and didn't want to kill it before it could spawn again. So I went back to my base to sort out my troops, turned back around and saw it marching straight towards me because it had hatched after I turned away from it. That jump scare's gonna stick with me as a highlight of that playthrough, I think. As for the actual content of the fight, there isn't much towards the combat in a vacuum. It's a very passive boss for the most part, not having any direct attacks, because it doesn't need them. It's made of a substance called gloom, which it leaves a trail of in its wake, insta-killing any Pikmin that come into contact with it. Outside of its face, you can't let your squad touch this thing. So more than any other boss in the game, your aim needs to be accurate. And swarming is entirely out of the question because its face floats above the ground, meaning you'd basically be feeding them straight into the wood chipper. That on its own would be solid enough, but it's the circumstances surrounding it that elevate it so high. Aside from the secret bosses at the impact site, it's the only fully optional boss in the game if you're going for 100%. It has no treasure attached to it, and you're not even guaranteed to see it. You'll only come across it if you choose to do so when arriving in the Distant Spring before the 15th day and you see the egg in the middle of these islands. And should you choose to engage with it despite your map indicating that there's no shit part as a reward, you're met with this beast of a creature that can easily dwindle your numbers if you don't know what you're doing. For new players who stumble across it, especially if they don't know what they're getting into beforehand, it can be brutal. You know what the most brutal part of it is though? Every other Pikmin 1 boss is consigned to its arena and won't leave, even if they're mobile. This does not apply to the Smoky Prog. Not only does it have free reign over the entire Distant Spring, its first instinct is to head straight towards your base and kill any Pikmin there. And remember when I said it's passive for the most part? Yeah, it has one other move it can do. This roar that'll pluck any grounded Pikmin around it, spawning them out of your control just so it can kill them. I respect the hell out of how this is the only enemy in the series to my memory that does anything even remotely like that, completely upending what's supposed to be your safe space, even using it against you since the onions can get in the way of your throws. All of this is with an incredible design, probably my favourite in the whole game, the most satisfying reward with the Pearl giving you 100 Pikmin for your troubles, and cool lore about how it's actually a malformed Mamuta. I love how polar opposite the two creatures are, with one being peaceful and the other being an embodiment of death and decay. And yet, I didn't find it nearly as difficult as the horror stories led me to expect. The fight is good, great, fantastic even, but once you know where you're aiming, it goes down quicker than I would have thought, and the lack of any real attacks outside of the Gloom Trail make it a little less engaging to be on the defense for. A lot of it is elevated by the context of its inclusion, and I don't think the allure of it would be quite as strong if it were a mandatory boss you fought in a standard arena. That's getting into hypotheticals though, and I don't want to judge it based off of a worse context that it isn't in. Obviously, it's still an amazing addition to the game. This is second place after all, but it didn't quite live up to its hype in the same way that the Water Wraith did in the next game. And if we're talking about the most difficult, dynamic, and lengthy fight in this roster, there's really only one who could rightfully wear that crown. Throughout my 3 playthroughs of this game, there is no part where I consistently lose more Pikmin than the final battle with Emperor Bulblax. Or I guess the Sovereign Bulblax if we're to take Pikmin 4's new classifications into account. No matter what you call him, this thing is an absolute monster, making an impression from the moment he bursts out of the ground in his arena when you approach him, and proving to be by far the single toughest enemy in the entire game. With all the other Bulborbs, you can normally get the jump on them by swarming them from behind or tossing some well-placed Pikmin onto their weak spots. Bulblax though does not leave himself vulnerable like that, and what would normally be a weak spot for the other Grub Dogs is now a place where he's practically immune to damage. Like the Cannon Beetle, you need to face him down directly and attack from the front, even though his tongue attacks have no limit to how many Pikmin he can scoop up at once. But hey, it's still perfectly doable. Just time things right and stay out of the way, making sure to call back any stray troops that start attacking his feet so he doesn't sit on them and crush them, which is thankfully his only other attack.
Where did he go?
Anyway, so this is the only boss in Pikmin 1 to have a second phase. Whittle his health down enough and he'll just start leaping around, with, again, no limit to how many Pikmin he can crush at once when he lands. And he is massive, so avoiding him with a full squad is quite the challenge. That may encourage you to take in a smaller army while your backup sits on the sidelines, but it comes at the caveat of not having as many to attack him with at a time. And that's the kind of weighing pros and cons I love when trying to decide on how I want to approach something in a Pikmin game. Speaking of that, Bulblax is a case where reds are the only ones you'll want to have directly attacking him if you can, but yellows can bring in bomb rocks which can stun him if you hit the tight window for kicking one into his mouth. Or you can sacrifice them to have him eat the bombs himself with his tongue attack, giving yellows their own utility, even if you won't be wanting to bring in too many of them since there are only so many bomb rocks available, which also means you have to use them efficiently and make sure you can get your reds on him quickly when he's stunned. Blues are kinda useless though, unfortunately, unless you're doing a self-imposed challenge or they're literally all you have left. You should only be using them for the puzzles before the fight. Oh yeah, the puzzles before the fight. Similarly to the water and plasm wraiths, this is a boss I feel is enhanced by the rest of the level before it, though in a very different way. Is the final trial a super interesting area? Nope. It's kind of piss easy, especially on repeat playthroughs. Just an arbitrary set of puzzles to waste a few minutes and make it so blues can't just sit the entire final area out. But also consider that Bulblax has a lot of health, and you can't attack him with your full squad at once if you're being careful, so the battle will last quite some time. Entirely doable within the 13-minute window of a single day, but when you factor in the final trial beforehand, suddenly things get a lot more interesting. The puzzles should only take you a few minutes tops, then you can easily end the day and give yourself the full time to fight Bulblax the next day, but trying to get both of them done in the same day suddenly makes it so much more tense. It's the kind of self-imposed challenge Pikmin thrives on and makes me like it even more. I failed on my first attempt, didn't even try it on my second, and got so close on my third. I was down to my last 15 Pikmin and had him in red health. I saw the countdown start and began to play more recklessly to try and get him beaten in those final seconds, and his death animation started to play frames before the day was up. I did it. Then I went back the next day and he'd recovered to full health. The bastards. Like the experience I mentioned with the Smoky Prog, that's something that'll help make Bulblax even more memorable to me, further cementing him as my favourite boss fight in Pikmin 1. So there's the list. Overall, I had so much fun going through this game again. Like I said in the intro, going back to basics after getting so accustomed to the modern conveniences was jarring, but in a way that made me like the experience more. For the most part anyway, I really miss how well developed the Pikmin AI got in the later games. I can really appreciate how far the series has come, and how well its first entry still holds up in spite of some outdated janky elements. I adore this game, and its roster of bosses is quite solid. 5 out of 8 bangers is not a bad ratio at all, especially when most of the others are entirely optional. Like, you are not going to see both of the Gulix and Mamuta on the same playthrough unless you're actively seeking them out. It'll probably be a while before I get around to covering 2 or 4 since they're so much larger, with 2 being a much more difficult game to actually complete, while 4 is super unclear about what I should even count. I don't care what the wiki says, I'm not including the Dwarf Bulborb. I don't know which of the 2 I'll do next, so let me know in the comments which one you'd be more interested in. Until then, go check out my video ranking Pikmin 3's bosses if you haven't seen it already, or whatever else turns up on this end cards. I'll call it here for now. Thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed. Have a good one.